right, and welcome back. This is our first conversation for this morning, and it's quite an interesting one. And we have joining us for this conversation none other than Mr. Asad Shoman, a man that needs no introduction. But it is good to have you on set this morning, Mr. Shoman. And we're here really to talk about a very important conversation, and one that a lot of Belizeans might ask, why we have this conversation that Belize, an issue that is seemingly so far-flung within the Middle East. And I've rationalized it myself, and just for me to settle with it, I think about the fact that we're talking about people here. We're talking about lives. We are humans as well, and we have a life. And what if we were in the same shoe? What if we were in the same situation? We would want conversations as such to be had about us, any part of the world, to be taking a situation that we would have if we were in this same shoe, to have that conversation, to show the importance and relevance of it. But Mr. Shoman, first of all, let's lay the foundation. Of course, we're talking about the Middle East, and specifically what some would refer to as the first live stream genocide in the history of the world, actually. Let's lay the foundation to talk a bit about how we even got here, how we even got to this point today.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to compliment you for taking those first few words that you said, but why we should be interested. Yeah. That what you said really is a definition of the word solidarity. Mm-hmm. You know, something that we need a lot of, because we had it when we were fighting for our independence. We had solidarity. That's how we won, because we had not so much the Guatemalans, but the British, right? It was a powerful country that wanted to force us to give away a part of our territory. Uh-huh. And it's only solidarity that stopped that. And part of that solidarity, I have to tell you, when I went to the United Nations in 1975 to begin the internationalization effort there for Belize's independence, the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, had the year before been accepted to attend as a sort of observer representing the people of Palestine. And they were very instrumental in helping us to get support.
A lot of people might not know that.
You know what I'm saying? So that's important that you said that. Now, in terms of the how we got here, you mean like the history of?
Yes.
Well, you know, you could go as far back as the mid 1960s, 1950s,
right.
Or we could
40s.
take it back to 1 year ago.
Right.
Where I know yesterday was the anniversary of October 7, 2023. Let's put it in context, take it back to, if we can summarize the last 80 or 8 decades, if you would, which led to perhaps October 7th last year.
Okay, that's good. So then you have to understand that Palestine was a country that is now taken up by Israel and what they call the occupied Palestinian territories, the whole of that, which was a vibrant country in the early 20th century, right? 1900s, early 1900s. It had been for many years, for many decades, centuries, controlled by the Turkish Empire, right? Which collapsed, was destroyed with the First World War. Now, what happened then was that the countries that the victors said, well, those countries that used to belong to that empire, they will become independent. We'll have a special system for them to transit to independence, right? So that happened with Lebanon, with Syria, etc., other countries. But it didn't happen with Palestine.
Why is that?
Because in 1917, remember the First World War ended in 1919. In 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, called Balfour, signed a letter, a very short letter, saying that Palestine will become a homeland for the Jews. Homeland for the Jews, right? Ignoring the people that were there.
Already there.
Right?
Yeah.
As if nobody was there. And in fact, those people, the Jews that wanted to create that state, were called Zionists, right? So it's not a religion, it's a nationalist movement. They want to have a state.
A lot of people think that it's a religious...
It's not a religion. Israel is not a Jew, for example. Israel is a state. It has to be treated the same as any state. And if it doesn't obey international law, it should be punished, right? But anyhow, so that's what happened 1919, and the rest of the years that followed, they encouraged Jews from Europe to go to Palestine. So you had Europeans, white Europeans, going there and displacing the native population. From the beginning, it was a settler colonial mindset. That's what you have to realize. It's a colonial situation we're dealing with.
It sounds like what happened in the Western world, if you ask me.
Well, exactly. So all these colonial powers now, and part of the motivation for Balfour, part of it, was that he wanted, there were a lot of, in Eastern Europe and Russia, etc., there was a lot of persecution of Jewish people, simply because they were Jews, right? They were
the Holocaust.
Right, well, that came later. But it's all part of the same story. So the British did not want refugees from those countries to flood into Britain. They were against that. They were anti-Semitic in that sense, right? In fact, the same Balfour that signed the famous Balfour Declaration, which is like the, I don't know, the foundation document for Israel, if you like. In 1905, he instituted and passed a law in the British Parliament to prevent Jews running away from persecution in Europe to come into England, right? So that was part of the motivation. There was some resistance, of course, once the population, the Palestinian population, the native population, saw all these people flooding in. First, they tried to live with them. Then they realized that the purpose was to displace them. Not to live with them, but to completely displace them. That was the purpose, right? So there was an uprising in 1936, which was brutally put down by the British and by some of the Zionist gangs that had been forming.
Who rose up? The Palestinians
Palestinian
rose
people,
up
yeah.
to defend their land.
Their land, right?
Okay.
And that was very important because that created a situation where the leadership and a lot of the people that were fighters for their independence were killed by the British. The British were engaged in the war, or about to be engaged in the war in Europe, but they dedicated tens of thousands of soldiers to go there. So by the time 1947 comes, and you had the Holocaust, right? You had the 6 million Jews that were killed, by the Nazi regime, the Holocaust. That created a lot of sympathy for people to go somewhere. No, they didn't want them in England. They didn't want them in the United States. So they tried to force them. And a lot of them then became motivated by this religious idea that, God gave this land to us.
Yeah.
And they had this,
per se,
right, they had this slogan, a land without people for a people without land. The land without people was Palestine, which was a lie. There were a lot of people there. For example, in 1947 then, the United Nations said, we'll partition Palestine, right? 52 or so percent goes to this new Israel, and the rest to the people who were there. Of course, the people who were there said no, just like if they would tell we, they were cut Belize in half, and we would have said no, right?
Yeah.
So the people said no, and then there was a little war there, and then the Israelis won because they were supported by the British in many ways. And they established a state at that time without borders. But what they controlled in 1948 was the whole of Palestine, except what we now call the West Bank and Gaza
Strip.
Right? And I wish you could show that on a map. Do you have it? Oh,
Yeah,
great.
so West Bank and Gaza Strip, those have been established for decades.
In 1948.
1948.
1948, right?
That's when these areas came to fruition.
Right. But now the Gaza Strip came under the jurisdiction of Egypt, right? They didn't incorporated. It didn't become part of it. It's just they administered it.
It shares a border.
Right, they administered it, and they were what is called the West Bank. Remember, all these terms are artificial terms that
Yeah.
were created in 1948.
Even to today?
Yeah, they're artificial. So that West Bank then was under the control of Jordan, right? 1967 war, Israel controlled everything, occupied the entire country.
Gaza, West
from the
Bank.
river to the sea, everything, right? It became one state, although they kept saying that they hadn't legally appropriated those territories. They, in fact, totally controlled it, right? Then you had there was an agreement between the fighters were still fighting for independence, right? The PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, became a fighting force led by Yasser Arafat, the famous leader of one of the factions and then of the PLO. And they were, one of the biggest blows they received was in 1982, which was the invasion of Lebanon by Israel. That was a massacre. That was something similar to what we're seeing in Gaza now, but it was in Lebanon.
Why at that time would Israel would shift its focus to Lebanon? Is it because there were Palestinians occupying Lebanon? Is it because Lebanon was seen as a threat to their pursuits?
No,
you
it's
understand
because
why?
the PLO had their headquarters in Lebanon, right?
Could that perhaps
Okay.
also show why Lebanon would now be siding with Hamas and be supporting persons in Gaza at this present moment?
Perhaps we could take our
Yeah,
time to get there.
That is very important.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Right? But just let me
good
try and move a
question.
little faster because it's taking
No,
too long.
take your time.
So in,
Yeah, we have an hour with you.
right, so in 1967, they controlled the whole thing. Then they started, the United States then by then was fully supporting Israel. So anything we talk about from then until now, and we say Israel, what we mean is Israel and the United States of America. They conjoined like Siamese twins.
How did this transition from the British to the US? Or why was that transition?
Well, look at Belize, my brother. We transitioned the same way.
It's true. It's
Right.
like a just natural progression. Yeah.
We are to a large extent under the influence, right, of
Yeah.
the United States of America.
Indeed.
In many ways.
Where does the interest
Political,
come
economic,
from?
military, everything. Yeah?
Where does the interest come from, though, with the
interest, sorry?
United States?
Well, they are the new empire, right? They want to rule the world. As you know, there was, after the Second World War, there was what many people refer to as a bipolar war. There were two major powers, right? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, that a lot of people call Russia, right? And the United States of America. And there was what you call a Cold War, because they didn't actually go to war fighting nuclear weapons. They both had them. That would have been senseless. So they call it the Cold War, which sort of ended around 1990 when the Soviet Republic as such fell apart,
Yeah.
right? And all the countries that they had some relationship with became, completely free of each other. And there was also a change within Russia, making it a capitalist country rather than a socialist country, right? So around that time, and another thing that's good to remember is that for that period of time between 1948 at the beginning of the Israel and at the beginning of the post-war situation, there was a decolonization movement, right? So India became independent in 1947. Now, that was what they call the jewel in the British crown. Huge. I mean, even now it's a bigger economy than Europe. And
is.
so you realize what India was a part of the British Empire. And so then the idea was the United Nations was formed with the idea of self-determination, etc. So the idea was that everybody was to be free.
Yeah.
Except Palestine. So Palestine, they said, no, you cannot follow the same system, you cannot have democracy. You must accept that the state belongs to these Europeans that came here a few years
Israel.
ago, that became Israel. Yeah.
Wow.
No, all right. And
So for us, sorry, just one last word. For us, for Belize, the importance of that is that it deals with self-determination, which is what we use to become independent. They were denied self-determination. So we have to fight for that.
And it's really a fight for self-determination that has been ongoing for decades, even over a century, one would argue, given the historical information that you've provided there. Let me put this question like this then. Does that justify or explain why or what happened on October 7th, where Palestinians practically launched an attack against Israel?
Right. It begins to explain it, yeah. Of course, but Gaza is a special situation.
Let's talk about it.
So maybe we should talk about that. So in 1948, what the Palestinians and the world knows the word now called the Nakba, which means disaster in Arabic.
Catastrophe.
Catastrophe. There was an expulsion, what we call now an ethnic cleansing of Palestine, where half of the population, about 750,000 people, were expelled from the territory, right? They went off, they had to go. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, wherever.
They were like
Jordan.
refugees trying to find safety.
Well, they were forced out. I mean,
Yeah.
but there were several massacres, massive. I mean, the Zionist gangs, right, would go to a village. They ended up
in Gaza.
eliminating all over Palestine. They ended up eliminating about 500 Palestinian villages. They would line up the men and just actually mow them down with machine guns, shoot them, right? There were massacre after massacre going on, all with an idea of pushing the people out to make it true that the land was without people, right? But they didn't succeed completely. They succeeded half. So they drove half of the population out. Now, those people are refugees now, from then until now, and the law, international law, says they have a right to return to their lands. They have a right.
Where would they have fled? To Egypt?
A lot of them to Jordan,
Jordan.
to Lebanon. A lot of refugee camps still in Lebanon, in Jordan.
Still
These
today.
refugee camps still exist. However, there were also refugees within Palestine. Now, this is where Gaza comes in.
On the strip that we would have
The strip
seen on
that
the
we
screen.
saw, right? Why is that?
We're going to it. There it
Yeah,
is.
right
Okay, so that's the Gaza Strip. It's quite a small piece, as you
Yes.
saw in the
They
full
said it's
map.
25 miles long and 6 miles wide.
You got it. So it's a tiny thing with over 2 million people,
Yes,
right?
the most densely one of the most densely
In the world,
populated.
yeah. Now, who are those people? 80% or 70 to 80% of those people living in Gaza are refugees from the rest of Palestine from 1948.
The Nakba War.
Right. So when the ethnic cleansing took place, people went to Jordan. They were forced out to Lebanon, etc., Egypt, but also many stayed in Gaza. So Gaza became a huge refugee camp, right? A huge refugee camp. As I said, 70-80% of the people are descendants, and most of them are from the lands right near to, right where you had the October 7th situation.
Wow.
You're beginning to see the connection.
Yes, the
now?
connection.
So these are people that are forced off the land, and they could
People
hear.
taking their
people taking
property,
and
living
enjoying
the
it,
lives that they.
living a wonderful life that
Wow.
they,
So-
they're caged up in this thing. What happened to develop to October 7th even more is that this peace process that began in the 1990s and so on, and you had the Oslo Accords. It was a disaster for the Palestinian people because it just set up a situation where Israel remains dominant. There's no Palestinian state, although it is promised, and the domination becomes apartheid, which is another thing that's very important
Yes.
that we should discuss.
What are the lives that these refugees would be living on the Gaza Strip prior to October 7th, 2023?
So, to get to that, I just have to mention that because of this peace process and so on, there was an election, right, run by the Palestinian Authority. Is something that was set up under the Oslo Accords by Israel United States, etc. Right? So they set up this authority of Palestinians, and they say, well, you have a right to control life in your territories, right? Ordinary things, like a tugboat or something. You run it, and security. Their security involves controlling the Palestinian population so that they don't attack Israel and so on. So they're collaborators with the Israeli regime, right? However, there was an election in 2005, and Hamas won the election.
First time we bring up that now.
That
We'll
they bring
talk
up
about that
Hamas.
more.
So Hamas was another, because the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, is made up of several parties.
Yeah, correct.
So the El Fatah is one of the parties, the main one, which was controlled by Yasser Arafat. But there were other parties, the Islamic Jihad, the Palestine Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, etc. And then Hamas was one of them, right? And Hamas was the only one that continued the resistance, right? The Fatah and others had joined into this Palestine Authority, collaborating with the Israelis. And Fatah was still saying, this is our land, we want our land. There was an election, they won the election. Fair election. One of the people that was there was Jimmy Carter. And he wrote and said, yes, this was a fair election, they won. But the United States said, no, we can't accept yours. And so they started to give guns and ammunition and so to Fatah to prevent Hamas from taking over, right? That they had won the election. And they succeeded in keeping them out of the West Bank, but not out of Gaza. So they came to control Gaza, Hamas.
So in this case, they would be seen as a political organization?
They were a political organization. They were religious based, as many are, in that part of the world. But they were a political organization, yeah, and they ran the country like our government does, with all the services, the schools, health, all the services, they managed and they provided.
There's this notion that, and I know that several international countries recognize this as well, Hamas as a terrorist organization, which your explanation puts their origin into context in terms of their purpose and their motives. But for those listening, when especially if you listen to Western media, you question now, with the context and the historical perspectives you've provided, why is Hamas considered a terrorist organization? And for you, what is your view on that?
Okay. So remember we said that this whole thing has to be looked at from the prism, from the perspective of colonialism. Right? This is a settler colonial situation. The same as South Africa, for example. Right? And you know what happened in South Africa? You had a movement, again, to fight against this occupation, against this oppression, against the apartheid. Right? And that the main movement there was called the ANC, African National Congress, which again included different parties, right? The head of it was Nelson Mandela. That was a terrorist organization, as far as the United States are concerned, as far as the British are concerned. Terrorist organization. Because they were fighting against the colonial master.
Fair.
Hamas is the same thing.
Fair.
I don't have to say anymore.
You really
You understand?
don't.
You understand?
Yeah, you really don't.
In fact, when Nelson Mandela was freed and visited the United States, his organization was still proscribed as a terrorist. They had forgotten to remove it from the terrorist organization.
Imagine.
Right, you know what I'm saying?
Imagine.
So those labels count for nothing, You can't say Hamas is a terrorist organization. If you say that, well, it depends on what you mean by terrorism. We'll come back to that. But for example, what they call the Israel Defense Force, which is really the Israel Occupation Force, that's a terrorist organization. Proven. Everybody recognizes it, except they don't say that. Because they have killed, I mean, if terrorism, at its basic point, right? I think when we say terrorism, we mean killing innocent civilians, killing people that are not combatants, they're not in a war, just killing civilians, that's terrorism, right? Who has done more of that than the Israeli Occupation Force?
So you put
That's a perfect example of terrorism.
Yeah.
So you put into perspective where the Hamas political organization would have come into play prior to the October 7th,
Right.
2023 date that we now recognize as part of history.
Right.
One of the things that I asked was the living situation of persons living on the Gaza Strip, as we mentioned,
Yeah.
such a small piece of land
Right.
with so many millions of people, 2 million persons living on it.
Right.
I have to ask, and we're going to take a quick break right after this, but I think this will be important for the viewers to understand what that situation, what life was like on the Gaza Strip, leading to that decision by the Hamas organization to strike on October 7th.
Okay. So quickly, I mean, history always has to come into
Yes.
prove, to show what's happening. So after that election in 2005, and that U.S. and Israel refused to admit, to accept, there was a division then, total division between Gaza and the West Bank. And then you had, before that, you had settlers, which will come to, settlers is an important part of what they call settlers, colonizers, Israeli colonizers, who go onto this same Palestinian land that's supposed to be for Palestine and put cities and towns in there, right? So had that in Gaza as well. You had that in Gaza. But the Hamas fighters and other fighters, you had others too, you had, as I said, the Popular Front, you had Islamic Jihad. They were resisting so much that the Israelis had to get out.
They left.
They had to leave. So they left, they pulled out the settlements. They had to force some of these people to say, no, this is for, no. They pulled them out because Sharon was a guy, Ariel Sharon, he was behind it. They pulled out the settlement, pulled out their forces from Gaza, and then totally isolated, by which I mean they built a wall up, a wall down, totally isolating Gaza from the rest of the world and imposing a siege on it, which has now lasted 17 years. Gaza started in 2006. Nothing comes in and nothing comes out without Israeli authority. Right?
It's really a prison.
Not only a prison. I've heard Jewish people, professors and so on, who have Holocaust family and so on, saying that is a concentration camp.
Imagine.
That's what it is.
25 miles of concentration camp.
Right. It's the biggest concentration camp ever in the world, right? There they are, comparable to any concentration camp that the Nazis set up.
So no goods going in.
Without Israeli authority.
And
right?
airspace, anything like that?
Everything,
granted?
the air, they destroyed the airport there. The air is totally controlled by Israel.
Wow.
The sea is totally controlled by Israel. You had a lot of fishing industry. Obviously, this is
The Mediterranean
just that
Sea.
part, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of fishermen, no, they restricted them to a small area near to the coast.
Wow.
If they go beyond that, they're shot and killed, right? So they control the sea, they control the air, they control the land, right? And therefore, there is no real economy within such a situation. A lot of the people there, a great majority, depend on handouts from the international community. So what happens, and it's going to continue happening, it seems. Israel destroys, right? And then the rest of the world has to pay for it. Not Israel, which would be normal, no? You destroy something, you help to build it up. You help to bring it back to life. No, that is done by the Europeans. And so who, of course, then put their conditions too, right?
Yeah.
So all of that is part of the background to 7th of October.
All right.
But I want to talk to you quickly about
ahead.
2023.
So before you get there, we're going to talk about it in our next segment.
Okay.
Right?
After the break, we look at 2023.
So when we laid the some of the historical foundations,
Right.
when we come back from the break, we'll talk a bit about October 7th, 2023,
Right.
the more than 1,200 Israelis that were killed on that day, as well as the 41,000 plus Palestinians that have lost their lives in what has been described as a first live stream genocide in the world's history. But before that, we'll take a break and we'll be right back. Stay tuned.